The kiss wasn't out of passion. It was out of desperation. For a second, she thought no one would see. The darkness of the basement, the complicit silence of the cold walls, and the muffled sound of a held breath seemed to hide what should never have happened. But the camera, installed weeks earlier out of pure paranoia on the millionaire's part, didn't blink. It recorded every gesture, every tremor, every approach that, for him, might have been a game. But for her, it was the edge of an abyss. On the screen, which he would later revisit out of habit or obsession, was recorded not just the kiss, but the entire fate of a woman who dared to cross an invisible line, drawn with threads of gold and prejudice. This wasn't a love story. It was the beginning of a punishment. The next morning, breakfast at the mansion was served as usual. Porcelain plates, silver cutlery, and there she was, head bowed, as if she still tasted the mistake on her lips. He pretended not to remember. Not a word, not a gesture outside of protocol. But tension hung in the air like a perfume hidden in the collar of his shirt, and when his wife entered the room, her eyes trained to capture the imperceptible, everything froze. The look she gave the waitress didn't say, "Good morning." It said, "I know." And in that instant, karma began to move, not like thunder, but like a cold breeze that precedes a hurricane. Because sometimes, what condemns you isn't what you do, it's what you pretend didn't happen. If this has kept you hooked this far, just imagine what comes at the end. Like and subscribe. The kiss happened between shift changes, when the whole house seemed asleep. The clock read 3:14, and the mansion's rarely used basement smelled of old wood and secrets. She was coming down, her uniform still damp with sweat from cleaning the sauna, when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn around immediately. She knew that sound, the imported shoes that only he wore, firm, expensive, always hurried. Except tonight. They came slowly, and when she finally met his eyes, there were no words, only a burning silence. The previous conversation, trivial, about a planned trip, seemed distant now. He approached without permission, but also without violence. And in that second, as she hesitated between retreating or advancing, he kissed her. It wasn't long, nor wild, nor tender. It was a gesture filled with guilt, expectation, and urgency. When she pulled away, his eyes didn't apologize. They asked for secrecy. The next morning, breakfast was served on the glass-enclosed veranda as always. Warmed bread, scrambled eggs, freshly squeezed orange juice. She kept everything exactly as it had been the other day, even though her hands trembled as she pushed the silver tray. He arrived with the newspaper under his arm, sunglasses on even though the sun wasn't shining, and said thank you with the same intonation as before, as if the early morning hadn't happened. She nodded silently, but felt her breathing heavier, that the world hadn't quite returned to its original state. The mansion seemed to be watching. The paintings, the mirrors, the hallways, everything seemed to know. Time passed slowly. Every second was a question, and when his wife appeared in the kitchen to order extra coffee for the guests, her gaze lingered a second longer on the maid's face. Those arched, finely shaped eyebrows rose just a fraction, and that was enough. She said nothing, but in that fraction of an inch of elevation, there was the question that would never be asked aloud. What did you do? The rest of the day passed in a disconcerting normality. Her bosses left for appointments, and she cleaned the hallway windows, as she always did on Wednesdays. The difference was in her thoughts. In each mirrored surface she saw her own reflection, trying to understand. Why didn't she push him away more forcefully? Why didn't she scream? Why did her heart beat so fast afterward? Was it guilt or memory? Was it an old desire or a new trap? She didn't know. She only knew that at the end of her shift, as she gathered up the rags and closed the laundry closet, a detail made her freeze. A small, fixed red dot blinked high on the basement wall. A camera, disguised behind an air vent. It had never been there before, or perhaps she had never noticed. That night, sleep wouldn't come. She lay on her side, eyes open, listening to the ticking of the clock on the wall, trying to remember where her hands were, where his eyes were, and whether that red light blinked before or after the kiss. It was too late to ask herself that question. The next day, when she arrived at work, she found a piece of paper on the pantry table. It was a change in her shift schedule. Her shift would be shifted to night shifts for the next few weeks, covering for the absence of the other employee who had requested vacation. The note said it was a coincidence. She knew it wasn't. Because coincidences don't smell like expensive perfume or a signature in the boss's wife's handwriting. She signed the acceptance, not because she had a choice, but because she felt that running away would be admitting something she didn't want to confess, even to herself. And in that moment, without knowing it, she began to pay the price for her silence. The next night, the silence was heavier. Not the silence of the house, but the silence she carried within. The mansion's luxurious furnishings seemed to watch her judgmentally as she walked the carpeted hallways, now alone until dawn. There was no laughter, no voices, no hurried footsteps. There was only the muffled sound of her slippers tapping the floor and occasionally the distant echo of a clock ticking the next out. The millionaire didn't show up that shift, but he left a folded note on the kitchen counter, addressed simply with a "For you." She hesitated, opened it, and found a single sentence. It was a mistake, but I don't regret it. No signature, no name. But the firm handwriting and the house's letterhead left no doubt. The kiss would not be forgotten. It would only be buried. The evening routine, though quieter, carried an invisible tension. The mirrors reflected more than necessary, and even the breeze coming through the windows seemed to carry murmurs. It was as if the mansion breathed louder, as if something was watching her every move. She was cleaning the stairs when she heard the snap of the camera rotating in the corner of the living room. She knew there were others, many others. Her wife had always been obsessed with surveillance. The security system was modern, controlled by an app, and connected to her cell phone, which was never out of her hand. The maid now knew she was being watched, perhaps not by her boss, but by someone who wanted to see her stumble, and that someone didn't need proof. They just needed time. As the days passed, the night shifts became a kind of purgatory. She was no longer asked to serve breakfast. She no longer cleaned the main office or the guest rooms. Everything was now relegated to the basement, the backyard, the areas where her presence wouldn't cause embarrassment. It was as if the house had been mapped to prevent her from meeting those who knew too much. But the real punishment wasn't the work. It was the tension, the fact that he was still there, the fact that he would pass by her at the end of the day when his shift ended, and their eyes would meet for a second, that same second. That had preceded the kiss. Now, however, there was fear. Fear that he would say something. Fear that he wouldn't say anything. Fear that at any moment his wife would call him to a private conversation and ask with cold eyes and a neutral voice, "Do you have something to tell me?" And this fear became more cruel than the mistake itself, because there was no escape. The camera had turned, the camera had recorded it, and even if the video was never used, the possibility of its existence was a sharp knife to her throat. In every dark corner of the mansion she wondered, has anyone seen it? Then, on Thursday, as he was gathering wet towels from the heated pool, he heard muffled laughter coming from the balcony. His wife was talking on the phone to someone, and between sentences blurted out, "You always know when a bitch falls for the boss." He didn't mention any names. He didn't look toward the pool. But the voice was loud enough. The tone was too precise to be a coincidence. The humiliation now was no longer invisible. It was whispered on the walls and spread through the hallways like a slow poison. And she understood. This house would no longer be a place. It would be a test, a full-time purgatory, where the mistake of a kiss would cost far more than tears. And when he went to clean the basement again days later, he found a brown envelope forgotten behind the bookshelf. Inside, nothing but a sheet of paper with a freeze frame, the exact moment of the kiss. Taken from the recording, printed in black and white. No note, no threat, just the image, as if to say, "We know, and we're waiting to decide what to do with it." That night, the frame remained under her pillow. She couldn't throw it away, or burn it, or return it. She simply held onto it like someone hiding a thorn under their skin, hoping that time would push it out on its own. But time, there, did the opposite. It buried it deeper. Every time she passed the surveillance room, even with the door closed, she felt as if invisible eyes were scanning her back. She began to walk with measured steps, movements calculated, as if every gesture could be interpreted through a cold lens and magnified by someone waiting for a mistake. Karma, she thought, doesn't usually knock on the door. It infiltrates the hallways. His wife wasn't confrontational, but she also didn't smile anymore. She didn't thank him for the coffee. She didn't call him by name. He treated her like she was part of the furniture, present but invisible, and this passive-aggressive silence was crueler than any shout. One day, as she passed through the living room, she saw the millionaire sitting in front of the surveillance system's large screen. His eyes weren't on his cell phone or the newspaper, but fixed on a frozen image. When she approached, he quickly changed the channel, but not before she saw it for a split second. It was the basement, the angle of the kiss, the exact moment. He was watching it again. Re-watching, reliving it. She turned away before he realized she'd seen it, but her heart was pounding like a siren in her ears. Why didn't he just delete it? Why watch it again? Was it guilt? Was it desire? Or was it something worse? It was control, the feeling of absolute power over someone she could do nothing about. And with that, she began to understand that the problem wasn't the kiss itself. It was what it represented. A captured moment that could be used against her at any moment, like a bomb hidden in a drawer. There was no room for error. Any step off the script and the video would be proof of her betrayal. The worst part, however, wasn't knowing he was watching. It was the suspicion that someone else might have access. The new kitchen staff's looks were strange. The butler, always very polite, now avoided greeting her. And one night, leaving later than he should have, she passed the guardhouse and saw one of the security guard's screens displaying a paused image of the basement. She wasn't noticed. She simply watched and backed away. The video was spreading. And what had been a secret between two now seemed like a weapon in everyone's hands. And no weapon is silent for long. Her breathing became shallower. Her hands trembled more. She began to lose sleep. She began to mess up simple tasks. And one Sunday morning, she dropped an entire tray on the kitchen floor. The noise woke part of the house. When her wife called her to the office, she expected a warning, a lecture. But what she heard was worse. "You need to rest, take 2 days, it will do you good." She said it with a dry smile. She didn't give him time to respond. The order wasn't a precaution. It was a strategic truce, a space for the poison to work within. In the room she shared with the laundry worker, there was now an uncomfortable silence. The others already knew. They didn't say it, but they knew. Because the scandal wasn't yet public, but it was already legend among the hallways. The video was the new ghost in the house. It didn't scream, it didn't cry, it just whispered in every averted glance. And she realized that condemnation would never come directly. It would come from the edges, in the withdrawn invitations, in the changed orders, in the manipulated schedules. And in the end, she wouldn't be fired, she would be forced to resign, like someone who jumps ship before they can say they've been thrown. His wife's bedroom was on the second floor, overlooking the gardens she herself had helped design. White roses, silent fountains, and perfectly aligned stone paths. During the day, she walked there with an almost rehearsed calm, like someone who lives to be observed and judged with admiration. But at night, after the windows were closed and the yellow light from the lamp was on, something changed. The hallway camera, discreetly positioned over the potted ferns, captured not only her steps, but her expressions. And one of them, on Tuesday night, triggered an alert. His wife was holding her cell phone with the screen lit and the video paused. It was the kiss, the frame of the kiss. But not only that, she zoomed in, rewinded, and zoomed in. She watched with morbid calm, like someone contemplating a piece before moving it on the board. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't argue. But that very morning, by direct order, the maid was relocated from the basement to the outer wing room, where the temporary employees slept. A polite way of saying, "You no longer belong here." The move was made without explanation, and when she tried to ask, the housekeeper's answer came in a firm voice. Orders from above. Just follow. The box containing her clothes was placed on the laundry cart, and she pushed it down, as if she were taking her own name into exile. In the days that followed, his wife became more present. He would arrive in the service areas unannounced. He would ask trivial questions with an almost maternal smile, but with analyzing eyes. Once, during a linen change, she came into the bedroom and said, "You know what bothers me most about cheating? It's not the act itself. It's the feeling that I've been made a fool of." She didn't wait for an answer. She simply turned and left. This wasn't an accusation. It was a suspended sentence, like an axe about to fall. With each new visit the wife made to the common areas, something changed. The objects the maid used to use disappeared. Her favorite pots, her sweet-smelling soap, even her uniform made of the lightest fabric. They were replaced by rougher, heavier options. It was as if her preferences were being erased, her presence diluted until only a shadow remained. But the worst was yet to come. One freezing dawn, while gathering the sheets in the guest wing, she heard a strange sound coming from the couple's closet. It wasn't a loud noise, it was a suppressed cry, as if someone were there, huddled together, trying not to be heard. She froze. She wanted to back away, but the sound stopped, and then the door opened. The wife came out, dry-eyed, calm-faced. Seeing the maid at the end of the hallway, she simply said, "It's going to rain tomorrow, bring the sheets in," and walked toward the bedroom without looking back. That woman, who seemed unbreakable, was also cracking, but not out of weakness, from recalculating how to return the pain. Calmer now, breathed behind the curtains. The next morning, the wife personally delivered a tray to the maid. Tea, cookies, and an envelope. "For you to rest when you can." She didn't explain the contents, and when she opened it, she found 2 tickets out of state, round trip, with the maid's name and a handwritten letter. "Please accept this gift. You need some distance to reflect. Your work will be here when you return." But she knew. This wasn't kindness. It was a graceful form of exile, and if she accepted, the wife would have peace. If she refused, she would know the game wasn't over. She didn't take the plane. The tickets remained folded in the bottom drawer of her makeshift closet in the staff room, not out of pride, nor out of resistance, but out of a kind of intuition that can't be learned, the same kind that got her out of New Orleans the day her mother's house burned down, the same one that kept her from getting on that bus that overturned on the interstate and killed everyone on board. She knew the signs of the universe, even when they came disguised as good intentions. And that ticket was a one-way ticket to oblivion. She didn't want to disappear, not without understanding why she had been placed on that painful itinerary. Before working in that mansion, she'd been a waitress in 3 states. She'd lived in shelters, family homes, small apartments shared with strangers, but she always knew how to maintain a kind of nobility in her gaze, not in what she said. She spoke little, but in what she endured. Her father had disappeared when she was 8. Her mother died of cancer when she turned 22, and the only man who truly loved her had been in prison for 6 years, after an accusation she knew was false. He'd been convicted because of a debt that wasn't his, but which he'd taken on to protect her. Since then, she'd been working to save enough money to hire a decent lawyer. That was what drove her. Not the desire to get ahead in the world, but the desire to free the one who had loved her silently. That's why the kiss with her boss was more than a mistake. It was a betrayal of everything she'd sworn never to repeat. The guilt didn't come from what she felt, but from what it made her forget. The moment his lips touched hers, the world around her fell silent, and for the first time in years, she felt seen, desired, but not loved. And that difference now hurt like a wound that wouldn't heal. The past came back in pieces, the Sundays in prison, the letters she wrote and never sent, the promise she made before the thick glass of the visiting room. "I'll get you out of here." And now there, cleaning the floor of a house that pushed her to the margins, she felt she had broken her own word. One kiss was enough to divert her soul from the only path that made sense. One night, he found an old photo tucked into one of the forgotten books in the mansion's library. It was a black-and-white photograph of a construction site under renovation. The same mansion where she now lived, decades ago, with workers lined up beside ladders and scaffolding. In the lower corner of the image, a face made her stop. A man with features similar to her boss but younger, and beside him a woman in a maid's uniform, eyes downcast, hands clasped. The caption read, 1946. Construction begins on the north wing. The woman in the photo could have been her grandmother, or someone who had lived the same story as her. It touched her deeply, as if the cycle had existed before her, as if that house had a long-standing habit of playing with the invisible lines between master and servant. She decided she would no longer be part of a pattern, but she didn't know how to get out. She didn't have enough money. She had nowhere to go. What she had was a weary heart and the certainty that she wouldn't fall again. The love that had saved her in the past was now her anchor, and when she received the call from her lawyer saying that a new appeal could open a breach in the imprisoned man's case, she understood why she was still there. She needed that job, that salary, and even though she was watched, judged, and pushed out, she would stand her ground, because in the end that was what he expected of her, and she would not fail. On Monday, the shift was changed again. Without justification, she stopped caring for the common area and became responsible for cleaning the garage and the outdoor service area, including the storage room, the ornamental chicken coop, and the back garden. The justification was an internal restructuring, but she knew it. It was punishment in disguise. The change kept her away from the house, away from the internal cameras, away from the eyes, and, most importantly, away from him. But the physical separation wasn't freedom. It was confinement in disguise, and she felt with cruel clarity that they were no longer just trying to punish her. They were trying to erase her. He walked around with buckets, brooms, and garbage bags as if invisible, and even when someone saw her, they pretended not to see. Their gazes were neutral, trained, like those of someone who already knows which side to choose in a silent war. The gardener, who once brought her cut flowers on warm days, now merely lowered his head. The cook, who shared secret cakes on cold nights, no longer spoke her name. And even the security guards, once friendly, began to retreat when she approached. The kiss had become a plague, not because it had been discovered, but because it had been seen. It was a stain everyone knew where it was, but pretended it was a shadow. 1. Cloudy afternoon, as she was clearing debris from the backyard, she heard muffled laughter coming from the glass balcony. They were there. Her boss, his wife, 2 friends, and a new employee. Young, slender, well-groomed. She served drinks with practiced steps, and the way he looked at her was identical to what she already knew. It stung in a strange way. It wasn't jealousy, it was indignation. Kissing her had become an unforgivable sin. But there, in front of everyone, he was starting another game, and this time with an audience. The difference? The new employee had the right profile. She was discreet, she was useful, and probably she wouldn't question anything. She understood. It wasn't about the kiss, it was about control. At the end of the day, upon returning to the outer wing, she found her locker locked. The lock had been replaced. When she went to the housekeeper to ask for the key, she heard the curt reply, "This isn't your space anymore. You've been temporarily relocated to the old storage room." And there, amid cobwebs and a musty smell, were her clothes and belongings dumped inside an open box. No respect, no warning, just the cold transference of someone who wants to push someone to the back until they ask to leave on their own. That early morning, as she tried to sleep on a mattress among old tools and boxes of expired products, a drop fell from the ceiling onto her face. She didn't mind. It was nothing compared to the storm raging inside her. But it was in that moment, with the constant dripping, that she thought of something she hadn't thought of in months. She was alive. Still there. Still standing. Still inside that house. And that, for those who wanted her out, was an affront. The silent resistance of the wronged is the greatest annoyance to those who punish. The next day, she wore her uniform more firmly. She put on lipstick, even though she knew the day would be dusty and greasy. and when she passed her wife at the entrance to the greenhouse, she said firmly, "Your garden is dying for lack of roots, ma'am." And she kept walking. She didn't look back. But she knew something had been planted in that moment. Not revenge, but a reminder. She still existed. The following days were marked by petty punishments. Contradictory orders, impossible tasks, absurd deadlines. She was instructed to clean 2 floors alone in record time, and no sooner had she begun than she was called away to another task. The food arrived cold. Lunchtime was interrupted by strategic calls, and any mistake, even the most trivial like a piece of silverware out of place, was amplified with a tone of contempt, always in front of other employees. There was no more disguise. The humiliation was now public, and yet she remained silent. A silence that wasn't cowardice but strategy. His wife led this new phase with cruel elegance, always polite, always correct, always with well-chosen words, but her words were sharp. At a dinner party, while serving dessert to the guests, she heard, "This pie was made by very skillful hands, hands that know exactly where to touch." The laughter was discreet, but looks weighed on her like sentences. Another time, passing through the living room, his wife commented to a friend, "Some people confuse favors with feelings. It's sad but understandable for those who have never been truly loved." It was always like that. Poison distilled with the softness of a French perfume. And yet, she refused to break. Not out of pride, but because of him, the man who was still trapped because of her. She wrote him letters every night, even without sending them. She told him every detail, every pain, every unanswered gesture, and she promised, through words blurred by tears, "I won't fall. I won't leave here until I've achieved enough to change our fate." This was more than a job. It was the final crossing before freedom, and she would endure it all, even the daily scorn. The harshest humiliation came one Sunday. They were organizing a charity event in the garden. Guests, press, cameras, and when dividing duties, she was assigned to collect trash without a proper uniform, while the other employees wore standardized clothing. When she asked the housekeeper, she was told, "We don't have a custom-made uniform for you anymore." She spent the entire day wearing gloves and dirty pants, surrounded by bags of leftovers and disgusted looks. And yet, she held her head high. Was this the punishment they wanted? For her to disappear out of shame? She wouldn't give in to that. But the deepest pain didn't come from the guests. It came from him, the millionaire. He passed her that day. He wore a dark suit, his eyes shielded by glasses, a glass of wine in his hands. And when he saw her there, sweaty, crouched, trying to balance 2 bags, he simply looked away, as if she were wind. That broke something inside her, because in that moment she understood that the kiss had never meant to him what it meant to her. He didn't see her as a woman. He saw her as part of the plot, as someone who could be deleted when the story became inconvenient. That night, she cried, alone, soundlessly, like someone burying a dream with their own hands. But when she woke the next day, something inside her had changed, not the pain, but the way she reacted to it. She no longer wanted justice. She wanted silence. She wanted distance. She wanted a plan. And looking at the bathroom mirror, where someone had scrawled the word slut in lipstick, she wiped it away slowly, calmly, without anger, because now she knew. The war was being won in silence. The next morning, when the hallway was dark and the air still carried the sweet scent of the greenhouse flowers, she found a note. It was taped to the mirror in the employee's bathroom, written in a handwriting that wasn't a woman's. Just 4 words. "I saw. I'm here." There was no signature, no explanation, but the impact was immediate. For weeks, she had lived. Amid cameras, trials, and isolation, and suddenly someone claimed to have seen. And more than that, they claimed to be beside her. It was a spark in the darkness, small, but alive. Over the next few days, he began to notice signs. A key purposely left unlocked, a coffee left on his tray with a note tucked under the cup. "Stay strong." Another time, he found a new pair of gloves in his locker, the same style he'd worn before the restructuring. And later, he heard from one of the younger Assistance that the house's former driver had returned, but now as a gardener. He remembered him from another time. Quiet, discreet, but always observant. He began to suspect the notes were his, or someone close to him, someone who knew more than he was letting on. The possibility of not being completely alone brought her a new kind of strength, but also doubt. Who else knew? How many there pretended to ignore it, watching it all unfold in silence? Could someone have seen the video before her? Wife? Or worse, had it been intentionally shown? The kiss now seemed just the tip of something deeper, a web of control, secrets, veiled manipulation. That house was a theater, and she, even hurt, was beginning to understand the script. The third note arrived on a Sunday night, hidden inside a library book. What they did to you, they did to someone else before. The enigmatic phrase reminded her of the old photo she'd found weeks ago, the woman with her eyes downcast beside the former owner. It felt like the mansion was playing out over and over again, cycles of seduction and punishment, of servants turned guilty, and of men who washed their hands of it with silence. It was a pattern, and she was at the center of it. So she decided to investigate. Discreetly, during a break, she accessed the house's small old file cabinet, located at the back of the garage. There she found records of former employees, letters of recommendation, and internal notices. Amidst the yellowed papers, she located a handwritten resignation letter dated 1978. The writing was shaky, the tone resigned. The employee said she was leaving because she could no longer bear being the target of stares and lies. No names were mentioned, but the pain was there, raw, as if it had been written the day before. There was a pattern, a cycle, and by resisting, she was breaking something bigger than she imagined. That night, he wrote his own letter, not of resignation, but of the future. He addressed it to the imprisoned man she loved. He promised the money was almost complete, that the new lawyer was already studying the case, that she would stay there until her last ounce of strength. Because now, it wasn't just for love. It was for justice. For all those who came before. For all those who were silenced and expelled with false smiles and tarnished reputations. She wouldn't go down without saying she saw, that she understood, that she knew. And for the first time, as she walked through the house in silence, she looked at the cameras and smiled, because now she was watching too. And she knew that time, the same time they'd tried to use against her, was beginning to turn. On Monday, the mansion dawned unnaturally silent. Even the birds seemed to have retreated from what was to come. At 10 in the morning, all the staff were called to an extraordinary meeting in the main hall. It wasn't common. It never happened. The boss sat at the head of the long oak table, tense, his eyes fixed on a random spot on the floor. Beside him, his wife, elegant as ever, delicately intertwined her fingers, as if controlling a bomb with her bare hands. The housekeeper read aloud a short statement. Due to recent internal disagreements and rumors that jeopardize the integrity of the team, we are beginning a new phase of evaluation. Everything will be reviewed: behavior, attendance, loyalty. They didn't name names, but naming names was no longer necessary. The silence after the meeting said it all. The invisible bomb, which had been brewing for weeks between glances and whispers, was about to explode, and everyone could smell gunpowder. The video, until then whispered in hallways, was now taking shape. No one spoke about it, but acted upon it. It was as if the entire house was living by a code everyone pretended to ignore. At the end of the shift, the wife asked the maid to go to the master bedroom for final adjustments to the housekeeping. It was the first time she'd been called there since the relocation. She entered cautiously but was greeted only by silence. The wife was sitting in front of the mirror, brushing her hair. She stared at her reflection, not turning around. Then she said, "Did you know that the things we try to hide end up turning into statues inside us? No matter how much we cover them, they stare back at us." The sentence hung in the air. The maid said nothing. She simply continued making the bed, folding the sheets with almost ritualistic precision. As she prepared to leave, her wife finally looked at her coldly and clearly. You're playing a game you don't understand. He does this to everyone, but none of them have had the courage to look me in the eye afterward. Until now. And then she added, if you want to get out of this, give me what you received. The maid hesitated. What? She asked, even though she already knew. The notes, the signs, the warnings. I know someone is trying to protect you, but this will destroy you, not save you. The threat was clear, and behind it a veiled confession. There was something to hide. And it wasn't the kiss. That night, she returned to the warehouse where she slept. She sat on the floor and began collecting the notes, not with fear, but with strategy. She placed them all in an envelope and wrote just one word: justice. The next day, the envelope was left on the desk of the former driver, now a gardener. Not a word was spoken. But when she passed him at the end of her shift, she saw something. Between astonishment and respect in his eyes, a silent agreement. Hours later, the boss hurriedly left the mansion, cell phone in hand, tense. His wife, alone in the library, threw a book on the floor and locked the door from the inside. The employees walked quickly, whispering among themselves, and at dusk a group of lawyers arrived discreetly through the back entrance. Something had been triggered, something that could no longer be contained. The video, perhaps, or part of it. The actual content, no one knew for sure. But eyes began to turn, no longer to the maid but to the couple themselves. For the first time, she wasn't the focus, she was the trigger. In the early morning hours, while cleaning the hallways, he saw his wife sitting alone at the top of the stairs, like a broken statue. Her eyes were red, her hands folded in her lap, and as he passed her, he heard, "You won. But be careful. Sometimes those who break the cycle also carry the weight of it." And there, without screaming, without fighting, without spilling anything else, she understood that what was at stake was never just a kiss. It was the entire game. And she had just become the most dangerous piece on the board. The next morning, the mansion seemed to breathe differently. There was a thick silence, as if the walls absorbed the accumulated tension. The gazes, previously cast upon her with judgment, were now filled with uncertainty. A rumor was beginning to spread. A file had been accessed from outside by someone no longer part of the household, a former trusted employee of her wife's. The news came in whispers, as if the fear was still present. But between each uttered word, there was a growing certainty. The video was beyond their control, and more importantly, she hadn't been the one to spread it. It was on that day that the truth began to seep through the cracks. In a gesture that surprised everyone, the boss skipped the business dinner with foreign investors, a commitment he would never miss. In his place, his wife welcomed the guests with impeccable posture but tired eyes. While toasting with champagne, someone discreetly dropped a folded piece of paper onto the buffet table. No one saw where it came from, but whoever opened it trembled. It was a frozen image of the kiss, now enlarged, in high resolution, with a stamp in the bottom corner, Backup Eero 2, External. There was no denying it anymore. The video wasn't a legend, it was fact, and it was circulating through unseen hands. In the staff quarters, she received mixed looks. Now there was curiosity, fear, and even respect. Some quietly asked if she was okay, others left food and water, or simply smiled when they passed her, as if recognizing there was more to her than the superficial story they'd tried so hard to convince her of. But the most unexpected gesture came from where she least expected it, from the former gardener, the same one who had returned weeks earlier as an assistant. Seeing her alone, raking leaves in the late afternoon, he approached slowly and said, "You need to know. You were used." What he said shattered what little he still held in his chest. He said the video had been planted, that the camera in the basement had been installed weeks earlier on direct orders from his boss with the justification of extra security. But the real reason was different. His boss was suspicious of his wife. He suspected she was planning something, and he decided to install cameras outside. The main circuit, where only he would have access. The basement camera wasn't part of the general system, it was personal, private, and that changed everything. The kiss was recorded not by chance. but because it was expected, because he knew something like this could happen, or worse, he wanted it to happen, not to use her, but to compromise his wife, to blackmail her, to build perhaps an alibi or a way out. She, the maid, had not simply been a victim of humiliation. She had been part of a plan she would never have chosen. She was not the center of the story. She was a ploy manipulated by someone who should never have approached her. Hearing that, a chill ran down her spine. She sat on the stone bench in the greenhouse and remained there for hours without saying a word. Everything she had experienced, the kiss, the guilt, the notes, the isolation, had been woven by invisible hands with hidden intentions. She hadn't just been hurt, she'd been used. And now she understood that her wife, cruel as she was, might also be a victim, in a different way, for other reasons. The house then wasn't just the scene of forbidden passion, it was a silent battlefield, and she, unwittingly, had stepped into the middle. In the early hours of the morning, she left an envelope on the library table. Inside, only a note. "Now I know." There was no recipient. She didn't need one. Whoever found it would understand. She no longer wanted to defend herself. She simply wanted everyone to know that she was conscious, that she was no longer blind, and that from that moment on she would no longer be an accomplice or silent. The envelope was found before sunrise. The housekeeper, who was making her morning rounds, saw it on the mahogany table, sealed with a brass clip. She took it to her wife without a word, simply placing it beside the tea, and left with her eyes downcast. Her wife didn't open it immediately. She ran her fingers over the paper, as if sensing a key. When she finally read the short message, "Now I know," there was no surprise, only confirmation, because deep down she knew the game had gone too far, and that the woman she had so humiliated now wielded a power more dangerous than the truth itself, the power to never remain silent. Hours later, the mood in the house began to change. The gardener, the same one who had silently passed on the clues, was dismissed without warning. His contract was terminated with vague justifications, and 2 more employees were reassigned. The mansion was moving quickly, as if trying to cover its tracks before the right eyes arrive. But what no one anticipated was that another employee, someone who never spoke, had made a copy of the video weeks earlier. Not out of blackmail, but out of fear. A young security guard, new to the job, who, upon watching the file, understood the enormity of the injustice and wanted no part of it. He said nothing to anyone. He just waited. Until that day. Without warning, he handed the footage over to the lawyer who frequently visited the house, the same one hired by his wife to resolve family matters. The lawyer, upon watching the recording, immediately understood that the problem wasn't just moral, it was legal. The camera had been installed without legal authorization. The location, the basement, was a temporary rest area for the crew. The recording, therefore, was illegal, and more than that, there were clear signs of premeditation. This changed the game completely, and for the first time the power was out of the couple's hands. That night, when the maid was called into the office, she expected everything. Except what happened. The wife, alone, without makeup, with a letter in her hand, looked at her wearily. "He's leaving the country. He admitted his mistake, but he's going to hide behind the money. Like everyone does, I lost." The sentence came not as defeat, but as bitter liberation. Then she handed the maid a sheet of paper signed with the house seal. Letter of recommendation, praising her ethics, her dedication, her resilience. "You're leaving, but you'll leave clean. At least that, I insist." The woman accepted the paper wordlessly, because in that moment she understood that all that remained between them was silent respect, a discreet form of apology. Hours later, as she gathered her few belongings, the security guard who had delivered the video passed her at the gate. He said nothing. He just nodded, and she nodded back. Because gratitude, when genuine, needs no words. She walked down the dirt road to the bus stop with firm steps, for the first time, without wondering if anyone was watching her. There was no more camera, no boss, no wife, no judging walls. There was just her, whole, knowing everything. At the small bus station before boarding, she called the lawyer handling the arrested man's case. His voice sounded hopeful. "I've received the last payment. Now yes, the petition will be accepted." She closed her eyes. She didn't cry, she didn't smile. She just breathed. She knew what she experienced inside that house would leave a scar, but she also knew that flowers grow from scars. Strong, silent, unbreakable. The bus continued down the narrow road, slowly moving away from the mansion that was now just a shadow in her memory. She didn't look back, not through the window, not in her thoughts. She carried only a backpack, the envelope with the recommendation, and the firm face of someone who no longer carries. Guilt, but rather the dignity of having resisted until the end. Her eyes were dry, but inside something stirred. It was no longer pain, it was a silent rebirth. Because she had won, no scandal, no revenge, just existing until all the others crumbled on their own. She arrived in a small town where no one knew her, but where an acquaintance of her mother's had offered her a room and a temporary job at a bakery. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't what she dreamed of, but it was hers. There, no one called her a slut. No one saw her as a threat. She was just one of the other women who served coffee, set tables, and swept sidewalks at dawn. And that, for her, was a profound relief. To breathe without fear, to speak without calculation, to sleep without waiting for footsteps outside the door. Over time, he began to walk the streets again with his chin held high. The simple routine restored a part of himself he'd thought lost. He began saving money again, small notes folded inside an old book. And every night he wrote letters to the imprisoned man, shorter, less painful letters. He told of the breads he learned to bake, the customers who smiled, the dreams that resurfaced. The tone was different. She was no longer a desperate woman. She was a living woman, until one day a call came. The lawyer, his voice cracking, announced, "We did it. The judge accepted the new analysis. He will be released until the end of the trial." She said nothing for several seconds. She just stared out the window and let the morning light touch her face. She didn't scream, she didn't celebrate, she just smiled. A smile full of everything. Full of the past, of loss, of resilience, and of victory. Because she knew that in the end, everything she endured had a purpose greater than pride. It was about redemption. The next day she took a bus to the capital. They met again in the courtyard of a temporary shelter, where he waited for her with tired eyes, his face gaunt, but with the same glow. As before, when he saw her, he didn't ask anything. He simply hugged her tightly as if holding time in his arms. They stood there, silent, feeling life begin again. They didn't need to explain themselves. They both knew what they had been through, each on their own side of the fence. Over the next few months, they rented a small room and built a simple but honest life, and she never spoke of the mansion again, or the kiss, or the video, because the past had been buried with dignity, and that was the only revenge she desired, to stay alive, without bowing down, without keeping quiet, without getting dirty. But secretly, she knew there was one last page to be written, and that fate still owed her a gesture, not of justice, but of symbol. Years passed. Life went on in silence. The man she loved was definitively acquitted after new evidence came to light, and together they moved to rural California, where they opened a small flower and gardening supply shop. The name was simple, Raíces. The clientele was loyal, and the neighborhood soon learned to admire the discreet couple who seemed to carry a deep history behind them, but never said much. She tended to the plants like someone writing letters, with affection, firmness, and wisdom. He served his customers with patience and calm eyes. There was peace, and no cameras. But one cloudy autumn afternoon, while organizing seed boxes on the back shelf, she received an envelope with no return address. Inside, a photo of the old mansion in ruins, with the sign hanging, fences fallen, and a sign out front. Court auction, property available. It wasn't a souvenir. It was a call. A wound that needed to be healed with one's own hands. The following week, she traveled to the site. The old mansion was unrecognizable. The garden, once her wife's pride and joy, was now a dry field, overgrown with tall weeds and dead flowers. The rusty gate creaked to the touch. There were no more security guards, no servants, no more arrogant eyes that stalked her through the hallways, just the skeleton of an empire corroded from within. At the local registry office, the auction was symbolic. No one was interested in a property embroiled in legal proceedings, but she was, not to live there, but to end her story properly. She bought the mansion for a paltry sum. She signed the papers with the same pen she used to write her letters. The notary didn't even suspect the weight of that gesture. She told no one, not her husband, not her neighbors. She returned to the place alone a few days later. She carried only a sapling in her hands, a small olive tree wrapped in cotton cloth. She buried it in the center of the garden, where a fountain had once stood. She dug with her hands, soiled with earth and memory, and carefully planted the sapling. In silence, without speech, without ritual, simply with her heart. And before he left a small wooden plaque planted next to the olive tree. On it, handwritten in black, marker, was a single sentence. What once silenced me now flourishes with me. He never came back. He didn't need to. The past didn't need to be rewritten, just buried with dignity. Karma doesn't come with shouts. It comes with roots. It grows in silence. And one day it blooms where everyone swore there would only be ashes.